Esther and Mordecai, Part 2, Babylonian Captivity. We left at the end of the first feast. Just when things were getting exciting, the queen said, "Come back tomorrow." So we'll pick this up in Esther chapter 6, because there's going to be an awful lot of things that happen from the time Queen Esther said, "I'll see you tomorrow," and when they do show up on tomorrow. So Esther 6:1, on that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, I guess they were a couple of rappers, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on the king. Now, since the king could not sleep, might as well have the Chronicles of the Empire read to him. As Providence would have it, he just happened to read about Mordecai informing the king's men about the plot to kill him. Verse 3, and the king said, "What honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for this?" Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, "Nothing. We didn't do anything for him. Nothing's been done for him." And the king said, "Who's in the court?" Now Haman was come into the outward court of the king's house to speak unto the king to hang Mordecai in the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's servants said unto him, "Behold, Haman standeth in the court." And the king said, "Bring him in." So Haman had come in early to get the king's permission to hang Mordecai. Instead, God just somehow reverses Haman's plan, and he becomes the one to honor him at the king's behest. So verse 6. So Haman came in, the king said unto him, "Haman, got a question for you. What shall be done unto the man whom the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought in his heart. It wasn't just a fleeting thing, but it got into his heart. It went from his head into his heart via his ego. "To whom would the king delight to do honor more than me?" Come on, he's got to be talking about me. And Haman answered the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let the royal apparel be brought which the king uses to wear, and the horse that the king rides upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. And let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal, whom the king delights to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Haman certainly embellished this honorable moment, thinking he was going to be the recipient. Yeah, I'll look cool as like the king. I'll be riding around the king's horse and king's clothes. Yeah, I like that. Verse 10. Then the king said to Haman, "Well, make haste, Haman, and take the apparel and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew." I like the fact that the king even calls him Mordecai the Jew. "That sits at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that that thou hast spoken." So Haman was certainly shocked, for it was Mordecai whom the king wanted to honor, and Haman was now to be the chauffeur. Haman had two choices: either do as the king commanded, or try to explain why he wanted this hero hanged. We'll see what choice he made right here in verse 11. "Then took Haman the apparel and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and brought him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, Thus shall be done unto the man whom the king delights to honor. Thus shall be done." And Mordecai came again to the king's gate. Yeah, just take me back up to my nice plush box here in the king's gate. I want everybody to see me up here. All right? But Haman hasted to his house mourning, and having his head covered. And Haman told Zeresh his wife and all his friends everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men and Zeresh his wife unto him. And this is an interesting statement. "If Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, for whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shall surely fall before him." They had heard about the stories of the Jews. They knew what had happened with Moses and the plagues and all these other things in their history. And this guy, one of his wise men, one of his friends said, "You're starting to spiral down. Don't get me in this picture anymore." And while they were yet talking with them, here comes the king's chamberlain, and they hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared. So, social obligations are social obligations. So, no more time to feel sorry for yourself. It was time to attend the banquet with the king, hosted by Queen Esther. Between yesterday's banquet and this one, certain rather notable events had taken place. First, Haman had gallows erected to be used on Mordecai with the king's permission that he has not received yet. Next, the king could not sleep and read in the chronicles of the king that a certain Mordecai had uncovered a murderous plot against the king and had not yet been rewarded. And then Haman was asked what should be a reward for a noble act. Thinking it was for him, he thought an elaborate parade should be given. It turned out to be for Mordecai, the Jew, his enemy, instead. Now the time for Queen Esther to make known her petition and request of the king arrived. You could say this is the cherry on the top for Haman. Esther 7:1, of having a bad day. So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen, and the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine. I don't know how many of you have been invited to a banquet of wine, but yesterday's feast was called the banquet of wine. We're going to have banquet of wine part 2. What is thy petition? What's your question, Queen Esther? And it'll be granted you. And what is your request? What is your wish? And it shall be performed even to half the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. Esther not only petitioned for her own life, but petitioned the king for her people as well. She had not disclosed until now that her people are in a kindred with the Jews. Verse 4, for we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondswomen, if we'd been sold for slaves, I would have kept my mouth shut, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage, or although the enemy could not have compensated for the king's damage. It would have hurt the king's treasury if he killed, if he would have gone through all of this. Queen Esther voiced serious concern, saying that since her people's lives had been bargained away, she had to speak up, seeing her life was also at risk. She emphasized that the times are urgent by utilizing a triple reflexive. My people and me, we are to be destroyed, we are to be slain, and we are to perish. Do you think she's trying to get a point across? She implied that it would be disgraceful for him if she, the king's wife, were to be sold into slavery. But how much more disgraceful it would be for the king if his queen was to be sold off for the slaughter. Verse 5. Then King Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he? Where is he that doth presume in his heart to do this? Who in his heart has gone to this length? And Esther said, the adversary, the persecutor, our vicious enemy is this guy right here, wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. In an instant, Haman had gone from a privileged banquet attendee to one who stood condemned and accused of hideous crimes. He had gone from being a proud, egotistical, power-hungry, merciless aristocrat as the word went out of his mouth. You know what they did? They put a hood over his head. They, they basically, They understood what the king was like, and he had all those guys hanging around. So as soon as that happened, they covered Haman's face. The king was none too pleased with what Esther had told him. And then to have it appear as if Haman had been forcing himself upon the queen just added fuel to the king's fire. Verse 9. And Harbonah, one of the chamberlains, and before the king, behold also. Hey, there's gallows outside, 50 cubits high. Haman had made for Mordecai. Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king. He stands in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him there. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. Proverbs 26:27. Whoso digs a pit shall fall therein. And he that rolls a stone, it will return upon him. Or Proverbs 16:18. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Don't you just love a happy ending? However, there was still some unfinished legal business that had to be rectified throughout the kingdom. Chapter 8, verse 1. On that day did King Ahasuerus give the house of Haman, the Jews' enemy, unto Esther the queen. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. King took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, gave it to Mordecai, and Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. So the giving of the signet ring to Mordecai gave him the authority over all of what was Haman's, and his estate was quite large. Remember, he had offered 10,000 talents of silver for the destruction of the Jews. Verse 3. And Esther spake yet again before the king, and she fell down at his feet and besought him with tears to cancel the evil of Haman the Agagite and his plan that he had devised against the Jews. Then the king held out the golden scepter towards Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, if it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews which are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil which shall come upon my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? So after risking her life again, by coming to the king unannounced, she pleaded with him to reverse the edict that Haman had him sign. The problem was that the laws of the Persians and the Medes could not be repealed, could not be taken back, even if you were thrown in a den of lions. Esther speaks to Ahasuerus in a series of conditional clauses rather than launching immediately into her plea that the genocidal decree against her people be revoked. Such an approach reflected proper decorum and flattered the king by placing her at his mercy and by subtly reminding him how much she meant to him. She also demonstrates great wisdom by mentioning only Haman's role in the hatching of this plot to exterminate the Jews, even though the king had really authorized it. He had signed the paperwork. Haman, though, was the only villain. Verse 7. Then the king Ahasuerus said unto Esther the queen and to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and him that have hanged upon the gallows, because he laid his hand upon the Jews. Write ye also for the Jews, as it likes you, in the king's name, seal it with the king's ring, for the writing which is written in the king's name, and sealed with the king's ring, may no man reverse. Because an earlier royal edict could not be simply canceled or withdrawn, Ahasuerus gave Esther and Mordecai the authority to write a counter edict that would supersede the first one and would work to the advantage of the Jews. Verse 9. Then were the king's scribes called at that time in the 3rd month, that is the month Sivan, on the 23rd day thereon. So we're looking at 2 months and 10 days, or 70 days after the first edict had been written. And it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded unto the Jews, and to the lieutenants, and the deputies, and the rulers of the provinces, which are from India and Ethiopia, all 127 provinces, and every province according to the writing thereof, and unto every people after their language, so he had it translated into their languages, and to the Jews according to their writing and according to their language. And he wrote in the king Ahasuerus' name and sealed it with the king's ring and sent letters by post, by couriers on horseback, because speed was now essential. You know, from Ethiopia to India, that's a long way. Riders sent the riders out, mules, camels, young dromedaries, mustangs, wherein the king granted the Jews, which were in every city, to gather themselves together and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power or all the force of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. So this edict gave the Jews the right to protect themselves and to kill any non-Jews, including their wives and children, who might attack them, as well as to confiscate their attackers' property as war booty. This edict, written by Mordecai, was an overturning reversal of Haman's original proclamation. This did not authorize the Jews to practice genocide on the Persians, but it gave them the permission to defend themselves against any who would attack them, their families, or their property. Verse 12. Upon one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, namely upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, the copy of the writing for a commandment or an imperial decree to be given in every province was published unto all people, and that the Jews should be ready against the day to avenge themselves on their enemies. So the posts that rode upon mules and camels went out, being hastened and pressed on by the king's commandment, and the decree was given at Shushan the palace. Everything has now changed. The cloud of death was removed for all the Jews. Permission had now been granted by the king for the Jews to defend themselves against any who assault them. Since the first decree could not be changed, this decree was designed to counteract the first one. And it was, to do it 10 days before the other one. Verse 15. And Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and with the garment of fine linen and purple, and the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness of feast, and they really had a good day. They weren't just saying thank you. They had a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews. Well, actually, it reads, and many of the people of the land, they didn't really, become a proselyte. They had common cause with the Jews. We're on your side, buddy. Mazel tov. For the fear of the Jews fell upon them. It may have looked from a five senses point of view that Mordecai not bowing to Haman, not reverencing him, had been the cause of the trouble that was going to befall on Mordecai and then on all the Jews. It may have looked like Esther's hiding her people and kindred was less than honest. However, God was at work behind the scenes to deliver his people, even though they were in captivity. Haman, a descendant of Amalek, had set himself against the Jews, much like his ancestors had done when Moses had led the children of Israel out of Egypt. And in the generation of Mordecai and Esther, God successfully brought deliverance to his people, as he had in the generation of Moses and Joshua. Esther 9, verse 1. Now, in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. Now, what this indicates is that there was more than just Haman that hated the Jews throughout the kingdom. The Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of the king to lay hand on such as sought their hurt. And no man could stand before them, for the fear of them fell upon all the peoples. And all the rulers of the provinces, and the lieutenants, and the deputies, and the officers of the king helped the Jews. Why? Because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. He had a reputation, and nobody wanted to cross it. Thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. And in Shushan the palace, the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men. Verse 10. The 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, they slew. But on the spoil laid they not their hand. And that's one of the things you're going to see, that they took out the enemies, but they had the right to the spoils of war, but they didn't take it. They just took the people out because they didn't want it to get around that they were only doing it for the money. On that day, the number of those that were slain in Shushan the palace was brought before the king. And the king said unto Esther the queen, you know, the Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the palace. We lost 500 people here. Plus the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? If we lost 500, how many other people did we lose in other 127 provinces? Now, what is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. Or what is thy request further? And it shall be done. Then said Esther, if it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan to do tomorrow also, according unto this day's decree. And let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. They hanged the sons of Haman after they were already dead for public humiliation, for deterrence. They're already dead. They didn't need to hang them again. You only get one death. But if a public humiliation, they'd already been slain in the conflict earlier. Now, verse 14. And the king commanded it so to be done, and the decree was given in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. For the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day. So the next day, they still had more business to do. Also in the month of Adar, and they slew 300 men at Shushan, 500 in the palace, 300 in the city. But on the prey that laid not their hand. Again, on the prey, on the war booty, they didn't touch any of that. But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together, and they stood for their lives. They stood for themselves and had rest from their enemies, and they slew of their foes 75,000. But they laid not on the hands of the prey. Again, they didn't take the war booty. They didn't take any of that. But 75,000 enemies of the Jews throughout the kingdom. And on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day of the same rested they, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews that were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day thereof, and on the 14th thereof, and on the 15th day. They had an extra day. They didn't rest on the 15th, and they made it their day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the villages that dwelt in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month Adar a day of gladness and feasting, and it was a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and from mourning into a good day. So, they didn't have to go to the first store to get a good day. They just turned from mourning to good day. That they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions, presents, delicacies, gifts of food, one to another, and gifts to the poor. So both in Esther and in Jewish Purim observance, there is not a victory celebration, but a rejoicing over relief from persecution and a celebration of rest. It celebrates joy and relief from harassment. In the book of Esther, God's giving of revelation has been hidden, but God himself has not been hiding. There are many clues that God was at work, but maybe not as openly as in other books in the Bible or in other people's lives, like Moses or Gideon or Isaiah or Amos or Samuel, or Josiah or Hildad. Verses 23. Let's move to 23. And the Jews undertook to do as they had begun, and as Mordecai had written unto them, because Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had devised against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is the lot, remember pur is the Hebrew word for lot, to consume them and to destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letters that his wicked plan, which he devised against the Jews, should return upon his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Wherefore they called these days Purim, after the name of Pur. Therefore, for all the words of this letter, and of that which they had seen concerning this matter, and which had come unto them, the Jews ordained and took upon them, and upon their seed, and upon all such as joined themselves unto them, so as it should not fail that they would keep these 2 days according to the writing and according to their appointed time every year, and that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, and that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed. They didn't want them to forget what had happened. Then Esther the queen, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, wrote with all authority to confirm the second letter of Purim. And he sent the letters unto all the Jews, to all 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim in their times appointed, according as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had ordained them, and as they had decreed for themselves and for their seed the matters of the fasting and their cry. And the command of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim and was written in the book. So Mordecai instituted this as a feast to celebrate every year, not God like the other Old Testament feasts. That is the history of the origin of the Feast of Purim. The name is derived from Pur, which was the lot that had been cast by Haman when he was determined to destroy the Jews. But his plan had turned out quite differently, and now the original casting of the lot Pur by Haman had turned into a remembrance called Purim, a remembrance of God's deliverance. Chapter 10 of Esther, it's only 3 verses. And the king Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land and upon the coast of the sea, and all the acts of his power and of his might, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? Haven't you read the Chronicles of the Persian kings? Well, if you do, you'll find this in there. For Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people. That's what Mordecai. He wasn't trying to get rich from other countries. He sought the wealth of his people and maintaining peace to all of his seed, to all the people of Israel. God was not hiding in this book. He was the wonderful delivering God who had blessed his people, Israel, when they had walked with and for him, as did Mordecai and Esther. Mordecai and Esther exhibited a laudable walk with and for God, and that God's people and the things of God were benefited. Now we're going to move on to Ezra, because Ezra now prepares to return to Jerusalem, and we'll start with Ezra 7 next week. But Psalm 122, 8 and 9 we'll close with. For my brethren and companions' sake, I will now say, peace be within thee, because of the house of the Lord our God, and I will seek thy good.